We are now officially through 1 full month of Pokemon Pocket being released, so I feel like it's a good time to go over our tier list, take a look at some of the changes in the meta that have happened. There have been some new cards that have released that have had an impact on the meta, and just flat out, some of my opinions have changed on these decks after playing more with them, seeing how they do in tournaments. So I'll be ranking close to every single deck that I think is relevant at all. I'll also be discussing decks that I really don't think are relevant. You'll see more when we get into the video. And if you guys are enjoying the content, please be sure to like and subscribe. I really appreciate the support. Okay, here we are on the tier list, and we got to explain what we're talking about, right? Like what makes a deck go into each individual tier. S tier, these are decks that I think genuinely could win 500 player plus tournaments. Those to me are the most relevant tournaments. Some of the decks in like A tier might win one of the, like 200 person tournaments, but I think that's far less impactful than winning a 500 person tournament. A tier is going to be, like I said, they could win one of those 200 person tournaments, but more importantly, they take at least a few good matchups against some of the S tier decks. They don't just beat one, they beat multiple S tier decks. B tier is going to be like, they might take one S tier matchup and a few A tier matchups, but overall, they are just nowhere near as strong. I really wouldn't expect them to win any tournament. Maybe they'll place like top 8 or something, but I don't think they're really walking away with any victories. Then our C tier is going to be like, yeah, it's a deck. It'll take decent matchups across the board, but when you weigh them for tournament meta share, they really won't be a great play. But either way, you could play these decks on the ladder. You will win. You might not have a perfectly positive record, but you'll have fun doing it. And then lastly, we have the no point tier. I'm replacing this with the F tier because there are just some decks that there are genuinely no point in playing, and you'll see what I mean when I get into it. But it's mostly for like, if you have one attacker that has multiple partners, well, there's no reason to play one of the other partners because it's just a strictly worse deck. So we're going to fill in the C tier first, and then we will, add in the no points as we go. So the first C tier deck I'm going to talk about is Arbok Weezing. I used to think that Arbok Weezing was like a B tier until I really looked at his matchup spread. Arbok Weezing takes a good matchup to Mewtwo, and that's pretty much it. Every other matchup is like 30 to 40% at best. This deck is just like a hard Mewtwo counter and nothing really else. It just doesn't have the late game power to get through some of these other decks. I mean, it can cheese wins, right? Arbok's Corner can catch your opponent off guard and end up winning you some games, but overall, it's just not a fantastic deck. I have found very little success with it on the actual ladder. Most matchups, I'm just getting bullied hard, so I'm not too much of a fan of the deck like I once was. And this is where we'll start filling in the no point tier, right? So for no, I'm going to put Muck Weezing. I don't see a reason why you would ever add the Muck in here. It just seems like too much. It doesn't seem consistent enough to be a great deck. And we'll also put the Arbok Pidgeot here. I think Arbok's just best with Weezing. It gives you the best chance of beating Mewtwo, which is really all you're trying to do. Next up, we'll move on to Golem Onyx. On my last video, I had a lot of people swearing by this deck, and I can tell you after playing it more, I still don't see any real validity for it. I'm sorry, but I really don't. I think you're asking way too much. I don't even think like the Pikachu matchup is all that amazing. I don't think this deck beats Mewtwo like people claim it does. If I was playing Mewtwo and I saw Golem Onyx, I would be so thrilled because I feel like I could just outplay them very easily. They need so much energy in order to get up and going and counter what I'm doing. I just don't think it's a great deck overall. Next, we will put in Moltres Centiskorch. Moltres Centiskorch just overall feels like a worse version of Moltres Arcanine or Moltres Charizard. The only reason why I'm giving this deck an actual ranking and not a no point is because you're using Centiskorch as a different attacker, right? It's varied enough. You're using a single prize attacker instead of a 2 prize attacker, so I feel like it deserves its own spot for that alone. But yeah, I mean, I've never seen this deck really do much. It's kind of just like the budget stepping stone to Moltres Arcanine. If you have your Moltreses, but you don't have your Arcanines or Charizard, okay, play it with Centiskorch, that's fine. You'll still win some games, but overall, no real point to stay on the deck after you've unlocked those cards. I hate to do this to my boy. I really do, because I absolutely love Executor. It is maybe my favorite card in the game right now, but Venusaur Executor, I looked into the data, and after, you know, just playing it all the time, I can win here and there, but just overall, this thing, this deck legit takes like 40% matchups across the board. Anytime anyone's ever played it in a tournament, from all the results I've seen, it takes like 40% matchups across the board. People doing decently well with it are mostly luck must have been on their side. It's also just very inconsistent to get that Venusaur set up before you get rolled over by any of the other decks. Very sad to put it here, but I just don't think it's amazing. It can be this deck, I will say, it has a lot of good matchups against the C tier guys, right? This is like the scourge of off meta decks, because a lot of the off meta decks are not hitting enough damage quick enough to deal with Venusaur once you get it set up. So it's very good at bullying all these other guys in C tier. He's like the king of C tier. If there was a format where you only played C tier decks, Venusaur would be at the top. But when you look at it in a broad sense, it's sadly just not good. And for our other no points, we're gonna put the Venusaur Caterpie and the Venusaur Lilligant, both just worse options than the Venusaur Executor. Neither of these cards fix the problems that Venusaur Executor has, which is, number one, consistency, getting that Venusaur set up fast enough, and two, sometimes you get into your Venusaur and some of these decks can just power through it, right? If you have a Mewtwo, a fresh Mewtwo, 150 HP, and it attacks into a Venusaur twice, that's 300 damage. You have to heal so much damage off that Venusaur to make it so the Mewtwo is not two-shotting it, that it's just really not entirely possible, and neither of these versions really fix that. I'm gonna grab Gengar as well. I'll probably put Gengar like here. Gengar is one that I don't think we have totally figured out yet, but I don't think that it's overall a really fantastic deck. Right now, the best partner for Gengar seems to be like a Kangaskhan and Golbat deck. That seems to help its early game. It seems to help it get through Mewtwo's better, but it is still the problem of Gengar tries to get into a two-shot war with whatever the last EX is after taking an early prize, and if your opponent plays well, they can sort of get around that. Like, you can imagine if you're playing against Pikachu and you spend all this time getting your Gengar built up, well, they can maybe send up a fresh Pikachu when you finally are ready to go in with your Gengar, attack into the Gengar, take a hit, retreat out into another EX that they've built up while you were, you know, wasting your time building up a stage 2. It hasn't really worked in practice for me. It's a super fun deck, right? I mean, you send up the Gengar, and now your opponent can't research, they can't Sabrina, they can't Giovanni, they can't do anything. It's like they have to deal with the Gengar in front of them. It's very, very fun. But sadly, I just don't think it has the capability to be a B tier deck or anything better than C. And adding to the no point tier, I will do Gengar, Gardevoir, and Gengar Hypno. Gengar Hypno has just felt way too inconsistent for me. You're a stage 2 double prize deck that's also trying to set up a stage 1. If you start the Drowsy, it's very, very bad because it has to retreat. Just kind of stuck there. You're not attaching a Gengar if you're trying to retreat the Drowsy. The Gengar Gardevoir, it's just 2 stage 2s. It's way too clunky in order to get up and going. Let's also throw Nidoking, Nidoqueen into C tier. Not much to say about this deck other than it's just not good. That's kind of it. That's all I got. Let's also get Dragonite Frostmoth. And when I'm talking Dragonite Frostmoth, I'm talking Dragonite Frostmoth and then some baby Articunos. You know, just some walls to help it take the time it needs to get set up. This is also going to be C tier for me. It has just too many weaknesses. Being a stage 2, needing 4 energy to attack. You're never getting 2 Dragonite set up in a game unless your opponent has done something very, very wrong. And then there's the classic, you promote the Dragonite and you go to attack with it and your opponent has some way to one-shot it back. Overall, just not a fantastic deck, but this is another one, like when I was talking about Venusaur Executor and I said that this is like the scourge of the off-meta decks. If you're playing off-meta, that's when you fear Dragonite, right? It is very hard for off-meta decks to deal with Dragonite. That 160 HP is very hard to deal with for a lot of these mid-tier decks. And Dragonite can just kind of roll you. So that is something to fear. It would also be, if there was just a C-tier, Dragonite would be on the top of it. But sadly, we got to look at all the other decks. So Dragonite, you're going to stay in C-tier. Adding to the no point, we got the Dragonite Hypno and the Dragonite Wheezing. Now, my main problems with the Dragonite Wheezing is you have to play 3 energy types to get any value out of the Weezing. Sure, you can like Koga it up, and maybe that's fine enough, but I think that there are better basic walls in the Dragonite Frostmoth deck. And the Dragonite Hypno, it's just it's another funny deck, right? It's like Gengar. It's just another funny deck. You're not playing it seriously. You're just playing it to terrorize the ladder and sometimes cheese out some wins. Other than that, if you took it to a tournament, you're not asking for a great result. And let's also get Melmetal into C tier. Melmetal, once again, very funny against off-meta decks. Against meta decks, not so great, right? It only effectively has 150 HP because of its ability that reduces damage. That's not going to get you through any Mewtwo's. Pikachu's can just hit it fast enough that it doesn't really matter, because Melmetal really benefits from playing against decks that are not attacking on the second turn, so you can use Melton's first attack to attach another energy, get into your Melmetal somewhat quickly, but when you're playing against fast decks, it just takes a really terrible matchup to it. It gets very hard to set up one Melmetal, let alone a second. Overall, just not a fantastic deck, but it can get wins against some of the off-meta stuff. Okay, guys, I'll be honest, I forgot about this deck until we are very far along in the video, so I'm spoiler blocking. That's why it looks weird. But we're going to talk about the Lieutenant Surge Raichu deck. It can go wherever and see. Like, I've played it. It seems like a cool idea, but in practice, you just need too much all the time. And there are a lot of times where you really need that Giovanni on one of your attacks, but you have to Lieutenant Surge in the same turn, or you want a Sabrina, but you have to Lieutenant Surge in the same turn. So overall, it just hasn't felt great. It just has too much every single turn. So for that, I'm gonna put it in C tier. Okay, let's talk our B tier threats. And first here, I'm going to put the Machamp Marowak. Very scary deck if it can get up and going. This deck is like, if you have the dream star of Machop attach, Machoke attach, attack, Machamp attach, attack again, there's not a lot that can, you know, do well against that. But sadly, that just doesn't happen consistently enough. Having the Marowak in there is cool. It's decent. It gives you another attacker other than just relying on the Machamp, which relying on just a stage 2 to attack with nothing else is pretty bad. It gets pretty tough. It takes some decent matchups against some of these higher placed decks that we'll get to, but overall, I don't really think it's anything more than just slightly better. Like, if you took it to a tournament, there's a chance you could get a top 8 in like a 200-person tournament. There's a chance you could get a top 32 in a tournament over 500 people. But other than that, yeah, not the best. While we're here, I think that these are just different enough that we can talk about just regular Machamp. These are like the two ways to play it. They kind of do equally as well as each other. I wouldn't say that one of them is necessarily better than the other. And truthfully, I haven't tested enough Machamp. Just, there's not really much of a point to put that much time into it. But from what I've seen from people playing the decks, it seems like Machamp and Marowak and just Machamp on its own do about equally as good. So I think that I would personally say that the Marowak version is probably a little bit better just because it gives you more options, but we'll put both of them side by side. Okay, next up, let's grab Alakazam Weezing. This deck actually does pretty decently, right? I'm not a fan of... I think this deck would be better if Weezing was a Psychic type, right? Because you really want to play the 2 energy. You really want to be attacking with the Weezing, and there are just times where that dual energy is really not going to do you any favors, right? Like, you're going to want to second turn attack with Weezing, and there are going to be games where you start with 2 psychic energies for your first 2 turns, and that's going to delay the Weezing. You're not going to be putting on any early pressure. Sure, you'll be building up your Alakazam, but this deck really benefits from the early damage from Weezing outside of just the poison. Then there's going to be the problem of you're attacking with Weezing and you want a Koga and go into the next Weezing, but you have a Psychic energy and you can't attach that Darkness energy to the bench Coughing to evolve it into a Weezing and start attacking again. That is really the main problem with it. Other than that, I think this deck is very good. Alakazam just seems to hit the magic numbers on like every single deck besides a well-played Mewtwo or a well-played Charizard. But against Pikachus, if you can get the Alakazam set up, which usually you can because the Weezing is such a good wall against Pikachu, you're going to roll them, right? I mean, you're just one-shotting Pikachus and then you're one-shotting whatever else they send up. If you don't already get a prize in the meantime while you're walling with your Weezings and attacking with it. And we'll add some more to the no point tier. My no point's going to get cut off, so I'll start adding them like this. We're going to just get all of these Alakazam variants in here. Alakazam Weezing is by far the best one. All of these others are just doing too much or too gimmicky. I mean, it's always the problem of playing 2 stage 2s with the Alakazam Greninja. You can sometimes just get run off the board before anything is up and going. Alakazam Hypno, I mean, Weezing is a much better wall than the Hypno, and Alakazam Gardevoir, same problem, 2 stage 2s, just not worth it. It's better to just play the consistency of Weezing over any of these decks. All right, now let's talk Blastoise walls. It seems like people have finally figured out what the best walling card is for decks like Blastoise, right? In the beginning, I know I was trying Blastoise and Snorlax, and the problem I found was that Snorlax just got stuck in the active too often, right? It has 4 retreat costs. It's kind of impossible to move it. Kangaskhan didn't feel the best because Kangaskhan's attack is so inconsistent. On average, it's only doing 30 damage, but a lot of the time you're going to flip double tails and just do 0, especially in products where it matters. But it seems like people have figured out, right? So you want to play Blastoise with the basic Mewtwo and the basic Articuno, and those are like the best basic walls in the game. So after people found this out, Blastoise seems to actually be working. This does just feel like a worse version of Charizard. I don't think that the benefit of being able to wall with 2 of these and then go into a Blastoise at the end of the game really makes up for the problems with it. And the real problems with it are, like, let's say you're playing against Charizard, which is the most similar deck to this. They can actually attack with their wall better than you can attack with your walls, because you need to be Mistying to the Blastoise in order to get it set up. If you're using Baby Articuno and you Misties to it, that's 1 less Misties for your Blastoise. You might not get to that 5 energy you need in order to actually attack with it. So don't love it for that reason. Charizard just gets to attack with the Moltres. It gets to double, set up the Charizard while it's building up to that, so it takes a really bad Charizard matchup. I'm sure it does fine against like Pikachu and Mewtwo and Arcanine and maybe some of those other decks, but of course it's a stage 2, like you're reliant on Misties as well, which just adds more inconsistency. There's a lot not going great for this deck. It almost, to me, it just feels like worse Charizard. If you want to play a stage 2 that blows things up, just play Charizard. But people are still playing it, and it's still doing fine enough. That seems to be a good enough strategy in order to earn it some tournament placements. But because it's worse Charizard, I gotta leave it in B tier. Add some more to the no point. Just Blastoise with anything but Mewtwo and Baby Articuno. Blastoise with Mewtwo and Baby Articuno, by far the best. All of these other decks, they are just strictly worse walls. You shouldn't pair Blastoise with any other attacker. Blastoise is the main focus. He needs all of your resources in order to win you the game. So just play Blastoise, Baby Mewtwo, Baby Articuno. Okay, now this one I'm a little bit torn on, right? We don't have enough data for me to want to put Wigglytuff in A tier, but I do know that it just got top 8 at a 500-person tournament, and it's like first revitalized showcase, because we just got the new Jigglypuff promo. The new Jigglypuff promo in testing has been very, very good, actually. I was a complete doubter of the Jigglypuff. I didn't think it would do that much for me, but there are games that you should have just lost, but because you had the option to go into that Jigglypuff and try to put your opponent to sleep, and they flip tails, it lets you come back into the game. So the Jigglypuff has actually been very, very impactful. I have won so many games that I shouldn't have strictly because of that Sing attack. So right now, I don't think it's proven enough to be in A tier, but I do think it's like, I think Wigglytuff is actually a pretty good card right now. And I can't wait to see where it goes from here if people find a better partner for it, because what people are playing with it now are, they are actually playing the 2 Arbok, 2 Weezing deck, and they're throwing in a 1/1 Wigglytuff as like the last attacker, because Arbok Weezing has that problem of its late game is just not very strong against a lot of other matchups. So the Wigglytuff seems to fix that up, and yeah, it's been doing decent for its first weekend debuted. Maybe we'll see some other variants of Wigglytuff that are better, so I'm not going to put any Wigglytuffs into the no point tier, because just straight up, I don't want to be wrong about any of them. I haven't tested enough with Wigglytuff to really know if every single one of these decks are going to be worse than what people are just playing the first weekend, but we'll see. Very excited to see where Really Tough goes, but for now, we'll leave it in B tier. It's still got a bit to prove, but right now, it's off to a good start. Okay, next up, we're going to talk about Marowak, Primeape, and we're going to also lump in Marowak Sandslash into this. These decks feel very, very, very interchangeable to me. Primeape is fantastic if you go second. If you go first, the Mankey Primeape feels very, very bad. Primeape only has 90 HP. It's really hard if you go first to get damage on the Mankey and not have it get knocked out, or somehow get your opponent to damage the Primeape without knocking it out so you can benefit from the full, the full attack for it. Sandslash is just very consistent, right? 100 HP, 2 energy, does 70 damage. Very, very good, consistent damage. Doesn't really matter so much if you go first or second. Obviously, I would prefer to go second because that means you can evolve into Sandslash without worrying about what your opponent's doing. But for the most part, they feel very interchangeable to me. I think I like the Sandslash better, to be honest, because of how bad going first with the Primeape package feels. Overall, Marowak Primeape has been around since the beginning, or Marowak plus other fighting attacker has been around since the beginning. It's always done okay, but it's really never had like a big showcasing. I still like it more than the Machamp deck because it's just more consistent. You run into the problem as well of Marowak's attack is very, very volatile. There are those 25% times where you are just going to hit 0 with your Bone Meringue, and that's the game, and nothing you can do. So it's just built into the deck. Again, hasn't really proved itself anything, super impressive. So we're going to leave it B tier. It's a real deck. It does well against some of the top decks, but just hasn't done anything too special. Next up is another very interesting deck that has just popped up, and it is this Mewtwo Greninja deck. So if you haven't seen it, you just play 1 Mewtwo, 2/2 Greninja line, and 2 Kangaskhan's. And what you try to do is you're basically an attacking Greninja deck that has the Mewtwo in the back to one-shot whatever your opponent has left to win you the game. I've been playing with it, and to me, it just feels a little bit too much like I'm always on the back foot. Every single turn feels extremely stressful, which makes the wins with it feel awesome when you can pull it off. But for the most part, it feels like very, very stressful gameplay. It feels like I could just do what this deck does with Mewtwo Gardevoir much, much better. But it has been getting some tournament results, so I gotta put some respect on it. I gotta put it in B tier. But it's just not something that I think really has a fantastic matchup spread against these other top decks, so we're gonna leave it B. And for our last B tier, we are just gonna do the basic Articuno, right? Basic Articuno, we all know what it does. It is a very gimmicky deck, right? Its main strength comes from hitting Misty's turn 1 and just knocking out whatever your opponent has in front of you, or just dealing that 80 damage to whatever's active and then dealing 80 damage turn after turn. It's very hard to deal with this deck if you get the turn 1 triple energy, or, you're going second, 2 energy Misty attached to the Articuno. Very, very hard to deal with, but it just isn't consistent enough to be A tier or S tier. There are other versions of Articuno that are much, much better, but the standalone Articuno, it's enough of its deck. I'll respect it, and I'll leave it B tier. I'm going to throw in a bonus B tier deck. This is something that I myself have cooked up. I need more testing with it, but I'm telling you, this deck has felt like it's felt kind of dumb. All right, it's kind of special. We're gonna have a video on it tomorrow, so if you want to see it, be sure to sub to the channel so you don't miss it. But it's gonna be this Executor Greninja deck with another third secret partner. I'm not gonna explain to you how the deck works. You'll have to watch the video, but from what I've been playing, like, the deck is actually just decent enough. I'm not going to put it like A tier or anything, because I definitely have a little bit of bias here. But I've been having so much fun. This is my favorite deck in the game right now. It will probably stay my favorite deck in the game right now. So be on the lookout for that video. It's a very interesting deck. I don't know why I didn't try this sooner, but now that I have, I'm in love with it. Okay, for our first A tier, we are going to do Articuno Greninja. This has been a recent development. A little bit surprised that we didn't really try Articuno Greninja sooner, because Starmie Greninja was like a day 1 deck, right? People were playing this before the global launch. It seemed like very, they had the synergy. fast water type that then gets some stage 2 support to boost its damage. It just all made sense. I don't love this deck more than the Starmie Greninja deck, strictly because, again, a lot of the strength of this comes from how good do those early Misties go. And if they don't go well, then the deck just doesn't feel as good as Starmie. Sure, you're a little bit more consistent in the fact that you don't have to evolve into a Starmie. You don't need to evolve into a stage 1 to start attacking, but that has never really felt like a problem for me with Starmie Greninja, so I'm going to leave it bottom of A tier. And next up, let's just throw the Starmie Greninja here in A tier as well, right? I mean, these decks have, this is just personal preference, right? These decks have both gotten some very good tournament placements. They have been doing well in tournaments. And that is strictly because they are very fast, very aggressive decks that get going early and can bully any other stage 2 deck in the game. Starmie is so incredibly fast and it does so much damage on turn 2 that, yeah, it can just run these stage 2 decks off the board. That's kind of been the story for, or the weakness for every stage 2 in the game as of now, right? Like, Pikachu just kind of runs through most stage 2 decks. Starmie does the exact same thing. So both of these decks are going to sit in A tier. And now let's get to our next Starmie Articuno variant, which is Starmie and Articuno together. This, I feel like, is the better deck out of these 3. Just a little bit more consistent than these 2. You're not relying on the stage 2. And I feel like even though they don't have necessarily the better, well, no, even the late game for this is good, because what a lot of late games come down to with Starmie Articuno is like, yeah, you're not one-shotting everything, but in most matchups, you can just cycle between the Starmie and the Articunos if you didn't already run them off the board, right? We're talking late game. You have 4 EXs that you can juggle between in order to prevent your opponent from getting that last knockout they needed. So I think that Starmie Articuno is the best version out of all of these Starmie/Articuno water decks, and it is solidly A tier. This thing has a good matchup against Pikachu. It has a good matchup against Arcanine. It has a good matchup against Charizard and Moltres. Those are all very, very solid matchups to take. It takes a bad matchup to Pikachu, but you can't beat every single deck, right? It's very hard to do that. So its matchup spread is fantastic. It also just dominates a lot of these B tier decks because it is so fast. Yeah, solidly A tier. Let's get our boy Arcanine in here as well. Arcanine Moltres is such a good counter to Pikachu. Takes a great matchup against Pikachu. Takes a pretty decent matchup against Starmie Articuno as well, or any of these, because its attack can just do enough damage to one-shot an Articuno. The matchup between these two becomes a 2-shot war, right? They're not knocking out your Moltres or your Arcanine in one hit. You're not, but you have the chance to knock out their Starmie in one hit if they leave it active. So that's why Arcanine and the Starmie Articuno matchup feels a little bit better than like the Charizard, because you don't have to set up as much for it. So Arcanine has been it's a very proven deck, right? As soon as people realize that this could be a deck pairing Moltres with Arcanine instead of Charizard, it's done consistently well. Just a fantastic deck overall. I love it. It is one of my favorite to play. So again, just a solid A tier. I'm actually going to move Arcanine down a spot because with recent meta developments, I feel like Starmie Articuno has had a really big buff to the good matchups that it takes. And we'll talk about that as we go further in the video. But let's now talk about Ninetales Rapidash, right? The best budget deck. This deck plays no EXs. It just relies on the speed and high damage output from the Ninetales and the Rapidash. It is, again, this is a deck that's been around since the beginning. It's gotten some top 8 placements. It's been doing pretty well. I think its stock falls a little bit now that we have another deck that is potentially S tier. Again, we'll get to that as we reach that tier. So I think it's gotten a little bit worse, but I still think it's an A tier pick. It benefits from that speed, just like Starmie Articuno does. It has that speed. It can run your opponent off the board before they can do anything if they're not an equally as fast deck. So we're going to leave him very bottom of A tier for now. Maybe he gets better in the future, but as of the way that the meta is going now, he's going to stay at the bottom of A tier. All right, we are finally here at the S tier, and number one we're going to talk about is Pikachu. I'm just going to lump in all variants to this, right? There are a lot of different ways to play Pikachu, and from what I've seen from those other variants, it seems like they all have pretty much the same matchup spread, but you interchange who you're attacking with to give you like a slight edge in certain matchups. So I don't really think that any of them are necessarily better than the other. They just take a little bit better matchup against some of the other decks, right? The real strength of this deck is the Pikachu, is the hitting for 90 damage on your second turn every single time, just being faster than every single other deck in the format. That's where the true strength of it comes from. Who you're partnering it with obviously matters for certain matchups, but it's not the end all be all. My personal favorite is the Pikachu Raichu. I love having that late game option of doing 150 with the Raichu if you have a Giovanni to go alongside it. The Zebstrika is great if you're playing against some slower decks and you can ping some damage around. You can maybe cheese a prize against a Mewtwo if they do not get into that, if they don't evolve their Ralts into a Curlia fast enough. So that's cool. But overall, yeah, Pikachu, I mean, just, we've all known he's been S tier for a while now. It's just the fastest, most consistent deck in the game. So I'm going to actually leave it at the bottom of S tier because I think there's two decks that are better than it. All right, let's talk about Charizard Moltres. And we are going to be talking about Charizard Arcanine Moltres. I think that this deck has been insane. This was such a cool meta development to see. And I gotta say something real quick, all right? Because I made some videos making some pretty bold claims about this Charizard when we first saw it pop up. And I had so many doubters, so many doubters. I don't need an apology from you guys, but I just need you to recognize that you were wrong, okay? This deck is insane. It just won, on its first week, it won a almost 600 person tournament. I believe it just won the Ursa Day Pocket Weekly this week, which is a 1,000 person tournament. To put it in perspective how insane that is, for the entire time that this game has been out, every single tournament above 500 people was won by Mewtwo. This is the first time one deck has actually won one of these tournaments that wasn't Mewtwo, and it's now done it twice. I said when this deck first came out that this was going to be a big meta shift. It's going to have the potential because it takes good matchups against both of the against the other S tier decks and some of these A tier decks and some of these B tier decks, right? Like, this deck is seriously something to look out for. It's going to shake up the meta, and it has. I still don't think that it is better than the number one deck, which we don't even need to play like we don't know what it is, right? It's Mewtwo. I still think that Mewtwo is the best deck. Maybe I change my mind as more time goes on and we see, like, if Charizard just keeps dominating these tournaments and winning every single one, then Charizard's the new best deck for sure. But I'm going to give it maybe one more week. And what this has done to the metagame is very, very cool, right? Like I mentioned earlier, Starmie, Articuno, all of these decks are much, much better now. Starmie and whatever it's paired with has already had a good matchup against Mewtwo. Its big problem is that it has a pretty bad matchup against Pikachu. Well, this deck now takes two great matchups against two S tier decks. Now we're looking at it like, okay, wait. If the metagame shapes up the way we think it is, and now let's say instead of Mewtwo and Pikachu both being 30%, maybe we get down to a meta share where Mewtwo, Charizard, and Pikachu all share 20% of the meta. Well, then Starmie is going to look like a much more attractive pick for these tournaments. Pikachu might even go down because, as we're seeing now, we're seeing like Mewtwo and Charizard dominate in these top 8s. Like, they are mostly Mewtwo and Charizards with like 1 or 2 Pikachus laced in there. So it seems like Pikachu's only getting worse now that the Charizard matchup is not so great for it. And the Mewtwo matchup was already not the best for it, right? Like, Pikachu can still beat Mewtwo, but it's favored for Mewtwo. Charizard is now kind of favored for Pikachu as well. So this has just been a super cool meta shakeup. We're now going to see like much more than just Mewtwo and Pikachu are the two decks to play. Anything else you're playing is only going to take a good matchup to 1. It's going to be almost impossible for you to win a big tournament. Just a lot of cool things are going to be happening with this new S tier that we have. I'm super excited to see how it goes moving forward. But that is going to be the list. I don't even need to talk about the strengths of Mewtwo. You guys know, right? You guys know what Mewtwo does. You know how good it is. That's going to be it for the list. Let me know what you guys thought of it. If I missed any decks on here, I'm going to tell you right now, they're probably C tier. I don't believe I left out any B or A tier decks. I definitely didn't leave out any S tier decks. So if I missed it, it's either a no point or it's a C tier. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please be sure to like and sub to the channel. I really appreciate it. Have a good one.